From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
J.D. Vance and Tim Walz share the vice presidential debate stage in New York City. Who got the best of this exchange, and what can voters take away from the standout moments on each side? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Bill McGurn and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. For 90 minutes on CBS and on the debate stage in Manhattan on Tuesday night, the running mates for Donald Trump and Tim Walz were prodded by the moderators and by each other on a range of policy issues. It was a fairly substantive, fairly polite debate. One of our analysts on the Journal's website today is calling it a very Midwestern debate between the Ohio senator and the Minnesota governor, not an insult fest. Bill, we can go through some of the specific highlights in a moment, but what was your overall impression of this exchange, and which of these men got the better of it?
I think that J.D. Vance got the better of it, not necessarily because his arguments were more substantive, though I think they were. I think the body language and so forth, if you're just watching, and if you're watching without Sandoff, he was very calm, very commanding, and very gracious. He didn't interrupt. And Tim Walz always seemed agitated and bug-eyed and so forth, and very nervous. He got better as the night went along, but I think J.D. Vance was more calm and looked more in control of the situation. He didn't shift and fidget around, so I think that counted for him. And I also think it was very wise. Look, both tried to make the case about the running mates of the other guy. Tim Walz tried to make the whole debate about Donald Trump, and I don't think he was successful. And meanwhile, J.D. Vance tried to make the debate about the Biden policies that have put us in the situation we are today. He was a little more successful. And he's more successful because even when he defended Donald Trump, he tended to defend Donald Trump's policies, his strongest suite, rather than defend Donald Trump in kind of outrageous statements and so forth. So I think J.D. Vance came across the clear winner for those reasons.
That was my impression as well. Vance's skill as a debater clearly coming through at least my television screen. He looked relaxed, calm, in control, earnest. He seemed forceful at times without coming across as overbearing, whereas Tim Walz struck me as flustered, maybe overprepared, maybe underprepared. He seemed sometimes that he was a step behind and trying to explain issues sometimes in ways that I found confusing, and I bet a lot of ordinary voters found complicated and not straightforward. Let's listen to one of the moments from J.D. Vance that is getting the most attention. This is him interrupting the CBS moderators when they begin fact-checking him about the migrants who are now living in Springfield, Ohio.
Just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank
Margaret,
you.
The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on. So there's an application called the CBP One app, where you can go on as an illegal migrant, apply for asylum or apply for parole, and be granted legal status at the wave of a Kamala Harris open border wand. That is not a person coming in, applying for a green card and waiting for 10 years. That is the facilitation of illegal immigration, Margaret, by our own leadership.
Thank you, Senator, for describing the legal process. We have so much to get to, Senator.
Those laws have been on the books since 1990.
Shortly after that, the CBS moderators said, "Gentlemen, the audience can no longer hear you because we have cut your microphones and we're moving on." And Monet, to me, that is a missed opportunity because this is right about when the debate on immigration was about to get interesting. J.D. Vance explaining, taking issue with this idea of temporary protected status, Tim Walz defending it. I wish the moderators would have let that go on and let those candidates have the argument that they were clearly raring to have.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, J.D. Vance absolutely got the better of that exchange with Margaret Brennan, the moderator. The context for that, of course, is the debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris that we recently had, in which the ABC moderators were extremely proactive, repeatedly fact-checking Trump and not doing the same thing with Kamala Harris in a way that really biased it. The CBS moderators, as Vance mentioned, had promised that they would not do live fact checking, and yet here they were jumping in, and Vance was able to actually point that out and then clarify his position. There was going to be a very interesting substantive debate on that issue between Vance and Walz, and that is the value of temporary protected status. The Biden administration has been offering parole to a lot of migrants coming from certain countries like Venezuela, Haiti, Cuba, etc. And that's one of the reasons why Republicans didn't sign on to the border compromise bill that was proposed in the Senate. And so it would have been very interesting and informative to voters to be able to hash out the relative positions on that issue.
Here's another moment from J.D. Vance that is getting some attention. This is his response on the question of abortion.
I never supported a national ban. I did when I was running for Senate in 2022, talk about setting some minimum national standard. For example, we have a partial birth abortion ban in place in this country at the federal level. I don't think anybody's trying to get rid of that, or at least I hope not, though I know that Democrats have taken a very radical pro-abortion stance. But Nora, one of the things that changed is in the state of Ohio, we had a referendum in 2023, and the people of Ohio voted overwhelmingly, by the way, against my position. And I think that what I learned from that, Nora, is that we've got to do a better job at winning back people's trust.
Bill, a couple of things that I think are interesting about that. One is that J.D. Vance, when he was running for that Ohio Senate seat, whether or not he wants to call it a ban or a restriction, he suggested that he would support a federal law limiting abortions generally at 15 weeks. So part of what he's trying to do now is square his record and his past positions with the arguments that are being advanced by Donald Trump, who has said quite clearly that he supports the Supreme Court's Dobbs decisions, overturning Roe v. Wade, sending the issue back to the states. And he thinks now there will be no federal law, and it will be up for each of these individual states to decide. But the other thing that I think is notable about Vance's argument is acknowledging that Republicans have lost many voters on this question, that the pro-life side, if you want to frame it that way, lost recent referendums, including in Vance's home state of Ohio. And this is an issue where many Republicans, I think, are trying to find their footing on how to talk about this. More of these referendums, by the way, are coming up on the November ballot. There are abortion initiatives that voters will be asked to decide in Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Montana, Nebraska, New York, Nevada, some of those swing states, some of them not. But Bill, I think that J.D. Vance is offering a model maybe for some Republicans about how to talk about this issue with empathy first.
Yeah, I think you're right. Look, I'm a pro-lifer, unabashed, and I have to say, I think we've never had worse political times for that position. I think it'll change over time, but J.D. Vance was right to try to deal with this in a spirit of empathy. I wish he had pointed out that when it comes to nationalizing the issue, Democrats are the ones doing it. They're trying to push a national law codifying Roe. Joe Biden issued a lot of executive orders on abortion. They're the ones nationalizing the issue. But as far as last night, I think J.D. Vance handles pretty well in the issue.
On the other hand, to my eye, this was one of his worst moments in the debate, pressed by Tim Walz, his sparring partner there, about the 2020 election.
This was a threat to our democracy in a way that we had not seen. And it manifested itself because of Donald Trump's inability to say. He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
Monet, maybe that is the answer that Donald Trump demands of anyone who is going to be his running mate in the 2024 election. But I think that is a political loser with independents, with some swing voters, with at least a few Republicans. And Vance has suggested as much a few times. He was asked on a podcast interview in September what he would have done if he were vice president in 2021 on January 6th in Mike Pence's shoes. Here's what he said. I would have asked the states to submit alternative slates of electors and let the country have a debate about what actually matters and what kind of an election that we had, unquote. And Monet, it seems to me that that is not a great answer for J.D. Vance, and I don't know why he hasn't had the time to come up with a better one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that previous answer that he gave, saying were he vice president, he would have asked for alternate slates to be submitted and considered, is much more damning than what he said in the debate, thankfully for him. I think that in the debate, he did tiptoe up to admitting Trump's defeat in saying that he left the White House on January 20th in 2021 and did not go as far as Democrats have implied in terms of standing in the way of a peaceful transition of power. But I think that, as Tim Walz pointed out, that's very different from admitting that Trump actually lost at the ballot box and was wrong to contest the outcomes of the election in all of these states. I do think that that continues to be a big liability for a certain type of voter who doesn't like Kamala Harris, but does think that Trump is dangerous and unpredictable and isn't willing to forgive him for what he did on January 6th and afterward. So there have been months, as you have implied, for Republicans and J.D. Vance first and foremost to think about how they're going to speak to this issue in a way that actually is persuasive to voters who still hold January 6th against them. And they haven't really figured out exactly the right way to do it. And that's going to cost them votes.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. So that was a moment where I think Walz won the exchange, and he was the one who was pushing J.D. Vance on that question about the 2020 election. But it seems to me that much of the debate, he was struggling to get his answers across. Here was one of his worst moments. He was pressed by the moderators on statements he had made that he had been in Hong Kong in 1989 on the day of the Tiananmen Square massacre.
I have poured my heart into my community. I've tried to do the best I can, but I've not been perfect. And I'm a knucklehead at times, but it's always been about that. Those same people elected me to Congress for 12 years. And in Congress, I was one of the most bipartisan people, working on things like farm bills that we got done, working on veterans benefits. And then the people of Minnesota were able to elect me to governor twice. So look, my commitment has been from the beginning to make sure that I'm there for the people, to make sure that I get this right. I will say more than anything, many times I will talk a lot. I will get caught up in the rhetoric. But being there, the impact it made, the difference it made in my life, I learned a lot about China. I hear the critiques of this. I would make the case that Donald Trump should have come on one of those trips with us. I guarantee you he wouldn't be praising Xi Jinping about COVID. And I guarantee you he wouldn't start a trade war that he ends up losing.
Bill, that was maybe not even quite half of the rambling answer that Tim Walz gave. The moderators then came back and said, sir, the question was what happened here when you said the statement that appears to not be true. Walz eventually suggested that he misspoke, but an odd moment to me because this is something that has been discussed in the press. And so I was saying earlier, I don't know why J.D. Vance didn't have a better answer on the 2020 election. And I don't know why Tim Walz didn't have 2 sentences memorized where he would be able to explain that he misspoke and then shift and parry off to something else he wanted to talk about.
Yeah, he just should have just said he's wrong. When they asked J.D. Vance about his statements criticizing Trump in the past, he just said I was wrong, and I don't believe that now. And the problem is for Tim Walz, this is one of many exaggerations or falsehoods he's told. It's kind of interesting to me because in 1989, I was in Hong Kong. I left in about April, right before the protests in Beijing came to a head in June. So I was there then. He arrived in August, and the demonstrations were pretty much over. Sure, there was a lot of changed atmosphere because of the massacre, but he has this habit. It's kind of like Joe Biden or Walter Mitty of inserting himself and implying that he was in these dangerous positions or right at the center of events. He was there when they were fighting for democracy, and he wasn't. And I think, there were questions about his military service. Clearly, Tim Walz is a guy who exaggerates his own record and can't defend it when he's asked. He's seldom asked about it, so it was nice to see the moderator press on the answer to her simple question.
But that was emblematic of his challenges in these debates because he would be asked a question and you could listen to many words coming out of his mouth while still looking for the answer to the question that had been asked. And let's go to the first question. The moderators responding to the Iranian missile strikes against Israel asked both of these candidates whether they would support Israel if it chose to make a preemptive strike against Iran. This is what Tim Walz said.
Let's keep in mind where this started. October 7th, Hamas terrorists massacred over 1,400 Israelis and took prisoners. Israel's ability to be able to defend itself is absolutely fundamental. Getting its hostages back, fundamental, and ending the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But the expansion of Israel and its proxies is an absolute fundamental necessity for the United States to have the steady leadership there.
In contrast, J.D. Vance said that a strike on Iran would be up to Israel. He suggested that if that's what Israel thinks it needs to do to defend itself, then its allies should back it. And he was pretty good, Monet, about always coming back and trying to answer directly the question that had been posed by the moderators. What did you make of this, which might have been the only foreign policy question in this whole night?
Yeah, I think that there are two explanations for the Walz non-answer on that question about Israel and Iran. The first is his kind of shocking and inexcusable lack of preparedness on foreign policy. You could tell from the way that he stumbled over the answer that he didn't have a lot of familiarity with the issue. And you could chalk that up to being a governor. You know, he's not someone who is on the national stage currently the way that J.D. Vance is in the Senate. But as Walz pointed out himself later in the debate, he was in Congress for 12 years working at the federal level. And even if foreign policy wasn't his focus, he should have developed a lot of awareness of international affairs during that time. And he should have been preparing over the course of the past couple of months to be able to answer questions about these topics. And he clearly hasn't done so. I think also you're seeing the fact that he is running on a ticket with Kamala Harris, who has gone very far to avoid any specifics on important foreign policy questions herself. When she's asked about Israel and its war in Gaza and its war in Lebanon, she tends to give very broad general answers of the kind that Walz gave on the stage. October 7th was a horrific attack. We support our ally. We want to make sure that they don't escalate too far and that they minimize civilian casualties, but not really giving you any perspective on what she would do, what direction she would try to take that conflict. And so Walz is kind of boxed in by the fact that he doesn't want to go out and say something that Kamala Harris herself wouldn't be able to say. And yes, you're right to contrast that with J.D. Vance, who, though he did begin answering the question by laying out broader context about what he thinks the state of the Middle East is and Trump's record on foreign wars, he did come back and answer the question very specifically. And I think that that would be a vote of confidence for voters who are trying to figure out, can I actually get a sense of what these different candidates are going to do on some of these important foreign policy crises the U.S. is dealing with today?